I've been deep in the bundler wars for a long time. My history with things like Webpack, Snowpack, and of course Vite is a pretty chaotic journey, and today a big thing happened. Something I never thought I would live to see the day of, but something I'm very excited to share with y'all. Vite won. It really happened. I honestly can't believe it, but at the same time it makes all the sense in the world. Vite has finally, after years, after almost a decade at this point, surpassed Webpack for weekly installs. There are a ton of reasons for this happening. There's a ton of details that this type of check from NPM trends does not really give you that are important to know and understand. I know we're all kind of tired about talking about bundlers. I understand. I've seen how the TurboPack videos perform. Believe me, I know. But at the same time, Vite is a really important technology, and the company that Evan Yu has built around it is going to change a lot of how we think about building software. And I'm very excited for that change because I have a traumatic history with Webpack that I need therapy for. Someone's got to cover those therapy bills and also pay my editor, so we're going to do a quick word from today's sponsor, and then we'll break down how Vite got here and what it does and, more importantly, doesn't mean. Building modern software is all about compromise. Do you want to compromise the user experience, the developer experience, or the security of your application? I feel like you always have to give up at least one of those things. Unless you use today's sponsor, that happens to be on my shirt. The more I look into Arcjet, the more I fall in love. They've really struck a magical balance between developer experience, a really fast solution for your users, and something so secure that you don't really have to worry anymore. If you're building an AI app and you don't think you need Arcjet, I'm just going to ask you quickly, how hard would it be for me to spam your generation endpoint with a ton of requests and give you an insane bill? If you don't have a good answer to that question, you should almost certainly be setting up Arcjet. Thankfully, it's not particularly hard to do. Let's take a look at the Next.js examples really quick. God, every time I scroll through this, I'm just in awe of how easy it is to set up something that used to be so complex. You define Arcjet, the AJ helper here. You pass it an array of rules. These are the different rules you want to apply to this instance. Here we have shield, which protects from common attacks. And then we have detect bot, which will set up bot detection to keep bots from going to your site. Something that I didn't even know was a thing, and I probably need to go set up on our stuff. You can define an array for allowing certain types of bot traffic. So if you want to make sure search engines can still scrape your site, but block other types of bots, that's how easy it is to do. It's not that easy any other way as someone who's had to build these things from scratch themselves. And the code for actually using this is even easier. Now that it's defined, we call aj.protect. We have our decision. It has an is denied, is rate limited, is bot, all these other things, and then you just return the thing at the end when you're ready to go. It's so easy to detect all the different ways that they might be denied and handle them in different cases. Man, if I'd used these guys for the rate limiting on T3 chat, we would have a lot less problems right now. Their blueprint section is particularly cool. It's examples on how to use their tech for various different things, like handling cookie banners, IP geolocation, VPN and proxy detection. But one of my favorites is the AI quota control. It's a really good example on how to handle refilling a bucket for tokens so that users can only use so many tokens every however long. So if you're trying to set up your app so users can do a whole bunch and then there's a cool off until they can do more, that's how easy it is to set up. Building this yourself sucks. Arcjet makes it so easy. And it's free to get started for up to 500,000 requests a month. That's an insane deal. I wish we used these guys for T3 chat. Protect your app today at soydev.link/arcjet. Vite has won, but to understand this win, we need a bit of a history lesson. This history lesson is going to start with Webpack 1.0. The original Webpack drop was all the way back in February of 2014. Kind of wild if you think about it. The reason Webpack was built is kind of obvious in retrospect. As we were building more and more complex apps that were pulling JavaScript from more and more different places, we needed a way to put them all into one JS file that we could ship to our users. What was the one with a wizard? Oh shit, Nolan has a blog post breaking this all down. Very fun. Yeah, browserify is the one I was thinking of. Browserify was the original solution for this. The reason this was needed was primarily the 6 connections per origin limit that most browsers and HTTP standards had, which made it really hard to fetch a lot of different files from one place at a time. So you had a lot of reasons to load all of the JavaScript at once as a single bundle. Previously, these bundlers were mostly for concatenation, where they would just take all the files and append them to each other to make one JS file. But Browserify was the first rethinking where it was a bundler instead of just a concatenator. Apparently, the original use of Browserify was meant to take Node code and let you run it in the browser by transforming the require syntax by flattening all of the stuff so that you could have code that the browser was capable of running. Because it's also important to remember that Node was starting to come up, and one of the biggest changes with Node was NPM. kind of wild thing to think about is that pre-Node, there was no NPM. I know it's obvious because it's the Node package manager, but without NPM, we didn't have a way to install and use these bundles, these packages, these things that we would want to include in our apps. The JavaScript we used was the JavaScript that we wrote, and we would occasionally have one or two libraries that were imported on the HTML page with a script tag like jQuery. But that was a script tag in your HTML that would go fetch jQuery from one place while you were fetching your JavaScript from somewhere else and then running it, expecting jQuery to just exist on the page. And if it didn't come in, nothing worked. There was no concept of a manifest, a package JSON that would describe all of the dependencies you had to bring them all in. Node introduced this idea with NPM. NPM was the first registry with a bunch of JavaScript code that you could grab the packages you wanted from and assemble them into something. Because with Node, there was no HTML file. You couldn't load the package by referencing the JS in the script tag. You had to get the JavaScript some other way. And NPM was the solution to Node not having HTML. But it turns out a package manager is a much better way to manage dependencies than putting script tags in your HTML and praying. A much better way. So NPM quickly started being appealing to people building web apps as well. And now, most of the most installed packages from NPM aren't for servers, they're for clients. But remember, Node is for servers, and NPM was meant to get packages to those server JavaScript developers building server-side code. And browserify was one of the first attempts to take those modules and allow you to use them in the browser with similar syntax to what Node allowed. Yeah, the chaos of the original syntax for just trying to check if a module exists on the global or not was obnoxious, and this solved all of it. By 2014, NPM had already grown to over 50,000 modules. I bet Node gets more than 50,000 modules published a day at this point. Kind of crazy to think that that was a big number. But browserify solved two problems. It made common JS module systems work for the browser, and it made Node built-ins and conventions like process, buffer, crypto, etc. work in the browser as well by doing polyfills and shims. It was one of the first solutions to really start doing that, so you could write code in Node and have it just work in the browser as you expected. Before browserify, modules were written with the expectation they would just run on the server and have access to all the weird Node stuff that you would do in Node, like next tick or set immediate. For browserify to just work, it had to handle the compatibility here. So it ended up re-implementing most of Node. But by doing that, it paved the way to this concept of NPM packages that you would use in your web apps. And now most web apps are being built with lots of different packages. If you don't believe me, go look at your package lock. You'll see a lot of stuff in there you don't even know existed. This article's awesome. One last shout out to Nolan for writing this. I'm pumped that I found it. And then Webpack happened. While browserify was picking up steam and more browser-ready modules were starting to appear on NPM, Webpack rose to prominence in 2015, buoyed by the popularity of React and the endorsement of Pete Hunt. Oh, Pete. This is a funny history, and this is before Vite existed, by the way, like way before. Reading Webpack's earliest version from 5 years ago, and it already had code splitting as a core feature. Mind blown. Pete Hunt discovered this unknown Webpack project and heavily promoted it. I believe it's a big reason why it took off. If you're not familiar with Pete already, he's a legend in the whole web dev world. He's the one who gave the talk Rethinking Best Practices that I recently did a video just kind of glazing because I fucking love that talk. It's so good. He is a huge part of how this modern JavaScript web dev world came out and came to be. And this is a wild piece of history. Webpack was trying to go way further with what browserify was doing, making it easier to take whatever files your project has, be it PNGs, CSS files, CoffeeScript, or whatever else you were doing, and make it easy to spit out static assets that your websites could actually serve reliably and reasonably well. Even things like requiring a CSS file or var SVG equals an SVG URL. Like crazy stuff that no one had thought of before. This idea that you can just import or require whatever. And now this is pretty standard. The core mental model shifts that Webpack introduced were this idea of defining all of the website's assets as a dependency graph, which makes it easier to define a component, which is a collection of HTML, CSS, JS, and images as a module. So if you can then break your app down by different routes, you can break down your JavaScript and other assets by those same routes. So you only have to load what a given page needs. There were other solutions that touched on some of these ideas like Gulp, Grunt, and more, but nothing had this cohesive vision of a graph of dependencies in your application. The second piece here was the JS-based module system for assets enabling hot module reload, which was a new idea at the time, where you would save a file in your editor and it would only update the parts that you changed, and your UI would change accordingly with a script attached to the DOM to just refresh the part when the new data came in. Very convenient when you're developing and making a change to your CSS, and the page automatically reloads with the new change. Super, super nice. Kind of fundamentally changed how we do web development. I can't imagine a world without HMR. It's a big part of why I don't do game dev, because you don't get benefits like that there. And the key primitive that unlocked all of this was the idea of loaders. Loaders would allow you to have different behaviors when different file types were hit in the request or the require path to determine how to handle those types of things. So new file types could be added as new loaders. The gaps between browserify and Webpack were painful for a lot of maintainers. They solved them all, but the difference in how they want to handle node, in quotes, was a big deal. It's pretty hard to dispute that Webpack fundamentally changed how we build software. I was trying to give some context of the before and during. One additional piece, so there was something that just drove Webpack way harder than anything else. Create React app. Remember that in the early days of React, it wasn't easy to add a different UI library, especially one that required that you write your code differently. It didn't require it. You could write React code without JSX, but you didn't want to. And the idea of React's component model, where you had these pieces that were reusable, mapped really well to Webpack's model of graphs of dependencies that were reusable and splittable. And those two came together very well in a way that made something like Create React App make a ton of sense. Because before Create React App, you would have to go configure Webpack yourself, configure the loaders yourself, figure out if or how you want to deal with JSX, get React added, and do all of that. Create React App was built to smooth out most of that process and just give you what you need to start working. More and more people were looking at those Webpack configs and getting scared because they're scary. They're very scary. And as such, they moved that to their own hidden scripts package in Create React App. And if you wanted to customize it, you'd have to eject. And oh man, ejecting was a decision, to say the least. Regardless, so many of these experiences were built around Webpack as the core. You can make the argument that Webpack was as essential to how we build web apps as React is to how we structure them internally. Like, React did to the code what Webpack did to the thing that we actually shipped, and the whole process around it. And now it's time for a fun lore drop. This is the Theo experience. We have to go a little bit further in time to 2017. Theo joins Twitch to work in Elixir. At this point in time, I kind of hated web dev. I'd even go as far as say I looked down on it. It's like, oh, you just dick around with HTML and CSS all the time. That's fun. Good for you. My takes were still based on the way the web worked via WordPress back in 2010. I just had not kept up with the modern web world. There were a couple people on my team that were kind of into this new React modern stuff, but it just wasn't for me. Didn't see the light, didn't care. The little bit of React I tried, I hated, and setting it up was miserable. And I didn't know about Create React App, and even if I did, it wouldn't have worked in the stuff I was working on. So I didn't care that much. Then 2018 comes, and the Elixir team died. It didn't die, it was folded into VOD. Because it was the premium content team. We were running the code for the marathons, like Bob Ross, Power Rangers, all of that. And Elixir was actually really good for wrapping FFmpeg and doing weird shit. The VOD team worked in Go. I don't like Go very much. I didn't know how much I would or wouldn't like it, but this is when I first deep dove, and I just couldn't do it. I hated it. So an interesting thing happened. My new manager, because remember, my old team folded, so I have a new manager here. My new manager pulled me aside, told me I was going to get fired if I didn't get my shit together, because I wasn't doing anything at this point, so I just hated working in Go. But I might like the new web dev stuff going on. At the time, Twitch had acquired a company that was really into React and really not into the Ember.js shit show that we had at the company at the time. And when they came in, they didn't want to work in that stack. So before we could even tell them no, they had started rebuilding most of the Twitch site in React and TypeScript with a modern, still Create React app based, but a much more modern suite. So I started working on that and started liking it a little bit. Didn't love it, but was starting to get it. Two important things happened. Thing one, hooks. I remember watching the React presentation when hooks first dropped. I'm a big functional programming nerd. I think that's pretty apparent. I love functional programming, and hooks would let me bring a lot of the patterns I loved and the way I think about applications and designing of software to the web, which was very exciting. But the more important thing is my team folded again. I got reorged 3 times in 2 months. I had my desk and office change 4 times in about a month. It was rough. It was a really weird time. And after that reorg, I was on the safety team. What does any of this have to do with Vite? Okay, we'll get to Vite, I promise. Just let me finish this tangent. I'll be quick. I was really getting excited about web dev stuff. I joined this new team, the safety team. Previously, safety was just like one person on chat, and now it was becoming a real team, which it needed to be. Now it's one of the bigger teams at Twitch because it's such an important problem. So I joined the newly formed safety team, and I helped unblock them from getting their changes out for the move to the new React site. Apparently, the safety team hadn't finished their dashboard for users for configuring moderation and whatnot on their streams. So that page was going to be stuck on Ember with the rest of the site moving to React. No one wanted that. So I came in and got it back on track. Everyone was hyped with it. And there was another project going on that was kind of behind. That other project was the internal safety tools for Twitch. When I say internal safety tools, I'm referring to the dashboard that things go to when you report something on Twitch, where a human will review it and decide if the person who you reported should be banned or acted on or not. Previously, these tools were built by a one-off contractor who came in and built an almost functional service in Rails and left us to maintain it. And we decided we wanted to rebuild it and align it with the site's tech. That meant a Go backend, a React frontend, and GraphQL as the layer between the two. Nobody really wanted to own the front-end side because the team was mostly backend nerds. Totally fine. So I got to take over the front end for these internal tools. This is one of the most important defining experiences of my career. And this was, reminder, about 3 weeks into me starting to write React code. I had just barely started writing React, and suddenly I am now running an internal tool platform, building a pretty complex web app. And the very interesting thing happened. The project had started before I joined, but it was in an old and pretty rough state. It was all based on Webpack 2. The company was upgrading the main site, but nobody was upgrading this, and I needed to get it working on Webpack 4. So in my first month of modern web dev, I was tasked with one of the hardest migrations imaginable. And this hurt. This is one of the most painful things I've ever done as a dev, learning JavaScript and TypeScript at the same time as I'm learning React, at the same time as I'm learning the deeper inner workings of Webpack. Chat's understanding this. I know you guys probably think I'm exaggerating. I promise I'm not. This was hell at the time. Y'all have no idea how lucky you are with tools like Next.js and Vite nowadays. 4 to 5 was easy. I did that in like a day. 2 to 4 took me like 3 weeks. And I had to learn so much about how the different loaders worked, bundlers worked, how our weird packages for doing UI stuff worked. I had to learn so much shit to make this function. And for better or worse, I loved it. I didn't genuinely enjoy being deep in the weeds of Webpack or anything, but the fact that web dev went from just throwing HTML and CS everywhere and using jQuery and praying to an actual deep, not traditional systems problem, but an architecture problem at the very least, figuring out how all these pieces come together and orchestrating it all made web development feel much more engineering to me. Before it felt like glorified design. Now I'm spending weeks on work that no user will even notice to solve hard behind the scenes problems to enable our team to move faster. And I like doing those types of things. I like when my code is invisible. And working on stuff like this made me take modern front end way more seriously and see a path to being an experienced engineer just through doing this stuff. This was the point where I kind of decided I was going to move my career towards web dev stuff. And at the time, Amazon and Twitch didn't have a lot of senior people focused on front end, so it was a bit of a risk. But I enjoyed this type of work so much and saw the importance in it so much that I started pushing my career in that direction. It's kind of funny because since I've pulled all the way back, but the history of how I've rotated between back-end and front end throughout my life is nuts. The point I'm trying to make here is I went to hell and back doing Webpack config real early. I deeply cared about and understood the weird behaviors of how Webpack worked, how loaders worked, how all of this interrupted into a thing that mostly came out in a reasonable state. I was writing my own bundle splitting and shit. One of the hardest things for me to transition to when I went to Vite was accepting that it would do bundle splitting. We'll rant about that in just a bit, but yeah. But now we need to go a little bit further into the future. So 2020 comes, I quit my job, I join a startup. I don't want to deal with all this again. I was supposed to be working on the mobile app at this new company, but I very quickly took over the website as well. But when I was building the website, it was meant to be a debugging platform, not the actual site. So I wanted something that wouldn't involve all of this config. So I was going to pick Create React App, right? No, not again. I know what that would mean for me. I'm not dealing with it again. But thankfully, a new solution had just come out, one that made a lot of sense for me, and one that I'm sure all of you know all about. Snowpack. Okay, none of you guys know what Snowpack is. I understand. You know what? I'm curious. Let's run a poll. As you can see, everyone's very familiar with Snowpack. I'll give a quick TLDR for those who don't know. Snowpack was built by somebody you almost certainly know. FKS. Fred Schott, aka the Astro Guy. Snowpack was built to try and solve a very real problem we were dealing with Webpack. It sucked to use and it was slow as hell. Snowpack was really focused on taking advantage of caching, making good optimized bundles for the outputs, having plugins similar to loaders for dealing with all the weird file types you might want, starting up really, really fast. That was a huge deal. You could just run the dev command and be deving almost immediately, which was not the case before it. Also handled fast refresh in HMR out of the box. Fast refresh is the page not refreshing when you make a change, instead just the component that you changes. Really cool behavior. Big thing that React had introduced thanks to Dan Abramov no-lifing it for a bit. Now it's the expectation. It's an extension of HMR. Snowpack had all of this built in and more, and it was one of the first really good bundler dev experiences I ever had. I had a great time using Snowpack to build things in 2020. It's the #1 dev productivity booster according to the 2020 JavaScript OS Awards. You get the idea. Although note, the update, Snowpack's no longer actively maintained and it's not recommended for new projects. Check out Vite for a well-maintained Snowpack alternative. Also check out ESBuild and Parcel. Fun. But Snowpack was the first one that I saw, and Snowpack was really focused on React and the other tools that I liked to use. And since it was 2020, and as you saw, the hype was in 2020, that's what I went with. I started building all of my stuff with Snowpack, and it was quite a bit better. It had its edges. It didn't bundle split quite how I wanted to, but I managed to get into the details and fix a lot of that myself. I was happy with the results, but more and more it felt like it was getting to be a lot of work to maintain the weirdness of Snowpack compared to other solutions. And also Snowpack was more and more being folded into Astro as the bundler for that. But most importantly, as we see here with some of these old tweets I found, midway through 2020, Evan Yu, who was working on Vite, which was meant to be the bundler for Vue, started figuring out other frameworks could benefit from it as well. And he spent a little bit of time trying to get it working with React. In particular, Tachi, who I didn't realize was following me. I will give him a follow back for sure. Tachi contributed the first working version of a React template for Vite so that you could use Vite in React. So at the time, remember, this was the Vue bundler. That was the point of Vite. And since then, things have changed so much. Meanwhile, here's Fred and Evan in this time capsule from 2020 where he was scared of trying to figure out fast refresh for React because they still didn't have it at the time. I'm pretty sure Evan beat Fred to it, which is still crazy. Because at the time, Snowpack was way further ahead on all of these types of things. But quickly, Vite started catching up. It was a really good base, working really quickly. And there's a huge fundamental difference in how Snowpack was built versus how Vite was built. Snowpack kind of rolled its own everything versus Vite, which was using rollup for prod and ESBuild for dev. The reason Vite did this is that during dev, it didn't really matter if you were fetching a shitload of files. It just didn't care because when you're on your own local device and you're hitting localhost to get files, getting 500 of them at a time is okay. But in production, that's not viable at all, especially if you're not on like HTTP 2. So rollup would do the traditional bundling thing where it would take all those files and bundle them into one or bundle them into route split, bundle split pieces. And it would provide those bundles, a more traditional thing for web users to pull down when they navigate across the internet. And this split was the big innovation that Vite brought. Instead of trying to build everything from its entry point down, Vite said, okay, we have really good solutions for doing production bundles. We have really good solutions for doing dev stuff that doesn't necessarily work for production. Instead of trying to build a solution that rebuilds all of this, what if we built the solution that pulls in all of this and uses the right pieces and gives you a standard layer on top to hit the right things at the right times? Turns out doing that's really hard, and a lot of weird gotchas and catches happened throughout the process. But because it had the strong ecosystem of rollup combined with the power of ESBuild, which was a Go-based bundler, it ended up being one of the best experiences for doing dev work. And man, those reload times in dev were unbelievable. Even in a medium-sized app like what I was doing at that startup, saving would take 2 to 3 seconds to see a change on the page at best, sometimes quite a bit more. With Vite, it was instantaneous. Like you wouldn't even need to measure it because it happens as soon as you hit save. And that was an incredible experience. Even if the actual bundles were a bit slower to build for the production version, dev was so much better that it was fine. And also the ecosystem of tooling around it was much simpler and nicer. The thing I was trying to bring up earlier, but decided it wouldn't really fit at the time, was the way that bundle splitting worked. As I mentioned before, websites have different routes. So if I go to /home, and this is a website that was built in React, home's going to need the React bundle, obviously, because everything's built in React. It's going to need some weird stuff specific to home, so home.js or something like that. You get the idea. And these bundles would be grabbed when you go to home. The React bundle would be reused by other things, so that would be probably broken out as its own vendored bundle. These are often called vendor bundles, so the ones with all the packages and things you needed. And then your code would be split into different pieces depending on what different routes needed. So /home would pull in these things. /fancy dashboard would also pull in React because everything's using it. But it would also pull in a ton of additional JavaScript for fancy stuff.js or whatever the fuck else. And now different pages are loading different JavaScript depending on what they need, and you don't end up loading hundreds of node modules when you're going to a random site's homepage. The way we would do this in tools like Webpack was mostly by hand. You would define entry points by hand in Webpack, so you'd have a file that you know is the top level file. Maybe this is the component that renders the whole route in React, and you would manually specify this as a top level entry point. You would say which entries exist. So these are the starting points for a given graph, and it would be able to then trail the graph, figure out what other things are needed, and split your bundles accordingly. But you had to manually define these entry points based on your understanding of the way the routes worked. This was very easy to screw up. It happened all of the time. Managing this by hand was hellish. Specifying the name split here for the files and making sure the right things were imported in the right places in your HTML. If you can't tell, I've been through it with this stuff. I spent a lot of time defining entry points and making sure they were split in the right places, shifting them around. And I spent a lot of time in my favorite plugin, Webpack Bundle Analyzer. I basically always had this running. I still use it all the time for T3 chat because it's using Next.js, so it's still technically Webpack. I would spend so much time in this looking at how the different breakdowns of our bundle occurred, what went where, because you had to at the time. This is how you would make sure the right JS was going to the right place at the right time. Otherwise, you'd just be bundling everything in all at once. And even then, you'd have to split out the vendor piece, so that would all be one giant module, and then different places on your site would have different stuff. Not very fun. It was awesome Webpack could do these things, but it was the capabilities Webpack had that it gave you, and it gave you a lot of knobs to turn in order to make it work, but it didn't do it for you. It had the capability to do it, and you did it yourself with it. And that was the mindset I entered Vite with, because that's how things would work. So when I started using Vite, I got everything working, bundling. It seemed fine in dev. And I was like, okay, time to start doing my route bundling. So I went and found the right entry points for the routes that I had defined. I wasn't using React Router because I thought it was too heavy. Kind of silly. It's not that heavy. I was using Wouter, Wouter. I still love this library as a simple minimal router for React, but you should just use React Router. It's fine. Or obviously Tanstack Router is great too. A lot heavier, but a lot cooler. The point is, none of those tools helped me with the bundle splitting. So I'd go through, see which routes existed, and I would manually break out those routes into their own files and then define those as entry points. So I started using this output.manualchunks piece in Rollup because that's how the production bundles worked. And I started manually splitting up these chunks to try and get it how I wanted. And I was running into a ton of issues when I tried. Eventually, I had everything broken down. I had all the modules that I thought needed to be split out. I ran the build. And I shit you not, I got an error that I had specified too many chunks. For a relatively simple web app, I was going insane. I just didn't understand how my maybe 17 or so chunks I had split out was causing build issues. I'd never experienced anything like that in Webpack. So I was going through, trying to debug, trying to fix it. And at some point, I run it, it builds, and I look at the bundle debug analysis tool. They had a similar one, like their clone of the Webpack bundle analysis. And it was the best looking bundle split I'd ever seen. I was like, oh shit, everything is so simple and clear here. This route gets this data, this route gets this data, this route gets this data. Easy, awesome. What did I change that made this work? I went to the config file that I'd been spending the whole day in and immediately remembered what I had just done. I was so fucking confused about the builds that I had commented out the bundle splitter. I had fully commented out the manual chunking in order to see if it would build. And it built. It built so well that it did a better job than I ever had done manually with bundle splitting. And that's when I realized the difference. When it clicked for me that the bundler was the thing that should be figuring out where these entry points are and doing the splitting for you, and that Rollup could do a better job at that than I could. I went from the guy who spent all their time in the Webpack config to the guy who spends none of it there, and I became a Vite power user. And good call out from chat, that was another Rich Harris win, absolutely. Rich Harris is the guy who made Svelte. He also made Rollup, and Rollup was magical. None of this was Vite specific. All of this was Rollup specific, but man, Rollup just absolutely blew me away. And Vite as a way to have a good dev experience using ESBuild and an incredible production experience using Rollup, absolutely magical, and it changed how I think about bundlers fundamentally. So hopefully you understand now how big of a deal Vite was by fixing the dev problem with ES Build, fixing the chaos I dealt with config via rollup, giving us access to the whole rollup plugin ecosystem, which meant most of what we needed was covered. And now Vite was a way more compelling option than Snowpack because Snowpack had to build all of these things itself. Even Astro is now built on top of Vite. That happened pretty quickly after Snowpack and the team behind it realized that Vite had won. They didn't try to fight longer than they should have. They realized the reality and they moved accordingly. Yeah. So where does that bring us now? Well, Vite very quickly became the default for the Vue ecosystem and started getting more and more traction in the React world as well. I know I was using it for everything I built, including the original version of Ping, my Zoom for Streamers product that I'm still very proud of. It's still the best way to do live collaboration. Love what we built here. This was built entirely on Vite originally. And the reason that we moved from Vite to Webpack, because I moved to Next, is because Next had specific bundling characteristics for server-side stuff. And Vite at the time was very client-side focused. This is why all the history early, I think, is important, because previously we were trying to take all of these server-side behaviors and replicate them on the client well enough to take advantage of NPM in that ecosystem. And since then, it's flipped, where now we have all these awesome things on the client side for how our bundles are being managed and split and all of that. And we're trying to bring some of the value there over to the server. And Vite took a very long time to embrace servers. It has now, to an extent. It's a lot better than it was at handling the server versus client-side code and whatnot. At the time, it didn't really do that. It was very focused on doing the best dev experience when building your web apps, and also the best bundling experience for shipping those web apps. No desire to think about servers at all. But that was okay, because Create React App already needed to die, and this accelerated its death immensely. God, I hate the troll that spiked Create React App installs that one time for ruining all of these fucking charts for me forever. It's very annoying. But even here, you can clearly see the shift where back in 2023, Create Vite was catching up, but Create React App was still the winner. It just stopped growing, though. Create React App died, and Create Vite quickly continued to grow, which is how you would create Vite apps. It used to be Create Vite App, and you'll see around this time, Create React App would get 100 to 120,000 installs a day, and Create Vite App would only get about 900. To be clear, install means something different here, but it also means something different than everyone seems to think it does, because when you run a command like npx create Vite app, it's downloading the module then. But if you're installing something on a server during your build steps, there's a good chance it's not even checking npm because it's just using the module that it already has cached. The point I'm trying to make here is that Create Vite has very quickly went far past Create React App and has quickly become the default for building new React sites. For comparison, Create Next App took even longer to surpass Create React App and still fights with it every day. It's doing better than Create React App is right now, but it's still dwarfed in comparison to Create Vite. It's also funny that Vite almost certainly is used more for React than Vue, which is what it was intended for, but it has absolutely dominated the market. I like using the create templates here rather than traditional module installs, both because it shows the amount of inertia these new solutions are getting, but also because you actually run this and get a download every time you create something with it. If we compare this to Webpack versus Vite, it's going to look very different because Webpack and Vite installs happen a lot more because you only create an app once and then you're installing things from it forever, but also because a lot of these installs are hitting caches. When we ran a build for our web app at Twitch, it would not mark an install on NPM because if we didn't change package versions, we were hitting our own internal cache. It wouldn't increment these counts. And a lot of the builds that people like we were doing, a lot of the builds that developers at companies are doing, aren't actually tracking on these types of trackers. These are the amount of downloads from the NPM official registry to a device, be it a dev server, CI, your own development machine. NPM installs are tracking how many downloads from NPM occurred. So I would imagine that right now, Webpack is still in the lead in terms of number of times it's used a day, because most of the time Webpack is used at these big ancient enterprises, it's not marking a download here. But I don't care because the inertia Vite has absolutely fucking trumps Webpack right now. It really feels like this is the end of Webpack times, and I'm so excited for it. But there are some people that are screwed by the slow death of Webpack. If you built heavily into the Webpack ecosystem because you have a company with hundreds of engineers using it every day, you've built your own custom loaders, you've built your own architecture around it, you've built your own weird way to handle importing of SVGs. God, I will never allow for importing SVGs in a code base I run again because it causes so many more problems. so many more problems. It makes everything impossible to deal with. Just fucking put the SVG in the file or reference it as a source tag. You don't need to import it. It doesn't benefit you at all. Anyways, Webpack has all of this tooling built around it at a lot of these companies. I cannot imagine Twitch moving from Webpack to Vite. That doesn't seem viable for a ton of reasons. There's also the problem that in dev, Vite breaks everything up into individual files using ESBuild. Instead of trying to bundle everything into one bundle you load, like other tech does, like Webpack does, and Rollup as well, Vite would just take the TypeScript files and turn them into JS using ESBuild. So if you're working on a site like Twitch, your browser's now loading about 20,000 files. That's not viable. That's not viable at all, even in dev. It works for a few hundred. It does not work for many thousand. As such, the current architecture of Vite is not well structured for these types of giant companies and businesses building these monstrously large applications. As such, other solutions are very appealing. Things like TurboPack, which might actually work by the end of the year, and RSPack, which is already working today, just with different goals and characteristics. TurboPack is Vercel's attempt to rebuild the entirety of the Webpack API in Rust, so it's way faster. It's being led by the dev who made Webpack in the first place, and it's not vaporware, but it feels pretty close, because as much as it might have kind of helped their dev experience, we only recently got to the point where it's compatible for prod, but I don't know anyone actually building their production stuff in TurboPack right now. And it's like 2x faster? Cool. Not the same. Then there's RSPack, which is a Rust-based rewrite as well, mostly built by the folks over at TikTok and ByteDance in order to make their giant, super micro front-endy stack work well. Scripted Alchemy, Zach, works his ass off on RSPack. Very smart dude. This has worked since they started building it. They went a different angle, which is how can we make this work and get it in, and then move more and more over to it over time, where TurboPack was, we're going to rewrite everything from the start, which just doesn't seem to have worked very well. Huge fan of how RSPack did this, not as huge a fan of how TurboPack did this. These are the options for those companies built on top of gigantic old Webpack stuff that want their dev experience to not suck. And to be clear, when I'm talking about these giant code bases, I'm not saying that Vite isn't viable for big companies. I'm saying it's not viable for projects that require you to load hundreds of thousands of files when you're working on them. Not saying Webpack's a good experience there either. It's not. There's a lot of caching you can do to make it less bad. But the best we could do for Twitch's Webpack config was like 8 to 10 second hot reloads, which was fine-ish. But it was better than your browser crashing because it was loading too many files. Checks and balances. Thankfully, the Vite team seems to have realized this. Remember, Vite is rollup plus ESBuild. ESBuild for dev, which is really fast but has the problems I just described, and rollup, which is a different ecosystem entirely used for the production builds that was not as fast at bundling as ESBuild, but had a lot of capabilities that were really useful. Their solution, which I've talked about a bit in the past, is Rolldown. Rolldown is Vite's Rust rewrite, because everyone's rewriting their bundlers in Rust now. It's great, isn't it? Anyways. Rolldown's goal is to take all of what Rollup does, rewrite it in Rust so that it can be used for both dev and prod. Now we have full bundles in dev, and we have a way faster build step for prod. If we can make everything go through Rolldown the way everything used to go through Webpack, it should solve a lot of these problems. And it's getting there very fast. I'm actually really impressed with the progress Rolldown is making after seeing the absolute hell that was TurboPack. Rolldown seems like it's already closer to ready than TurboPack is, and TurboPack had like a 4-year lead. I'm excited to see where this goes. So to TLDR my takes, Webpack installs is a fake number because the companies building on Webpack are hitting caches, they're not hitting NPM directly. Even Next.js installs aren't going to count as Webpack installs because they use Webpack via NCC, which is a module that they built in order to, at build time, take all of the dependencies for a node project and take all those node modules and bundle them into one thing. So instead of having 17 fucking peer deps, you just install Next.js and it has all of those things bundled into its one main bundle. Kind of a chaotic way of doing things, but I get why they did it. They wanted to abstract everything and just give you this one piece of JS that would handle everything you need it to. I've spent way too much time in NCC. I found the name of it because I forgot because I used it for webhook thing. It's really useful for some very specific cases, mostly keeping your peer depths from getting chaotic. But yeah, you get the idea. There's a lot of places where your Webpack installs don't count, much more so than in Vite. But the other important point, Vite is the right default. Very, very much agree there. Oh, and one other thing. I didn't touch on this much before, but it's important to know. This has nothing to do with vibe coding. A lot of people seem to think that these spikes are because vibe coding tools are running a lot of NPM installs. And it certainly looks that way. But it would make no sense for companies like Lovable, Bolt, V0, etc. to actually fetch the module from Node every time, because they have templates they've already built that are how the code bases start most of the time. And those templates are using modules that are coming from a cache that they already made. And if they weren't doing that, everything would be much worse to use because you'd be waiting for it to download the module from NPM every time you start a new thing. So obviously a spike of lovable users isn't going to meaningfully impact these graphs. So stop pretending it is. This has nothing to do with vibe coding. This is because Vite's the right default, and most projects should be starting with it. Its future's really bright. It is the right thing to win for the majority of web apps. Ignore the Webpack install numbers, because as much as Vite is winning, those numbers don't necessarily mean anything anymore for a ton of reasons. Caching kills what those numbers would mean at the scales that we're talking about here. But nobody is choosing Webpack anymore. And that's the real important win here. Nobody is choosing to use Webpack in 2025. You're maintaining an old Webpack code base, perhaps, but you're not starting a new thing and saying, I'm going to use Webpack here because I want to. Either the tools you're using picked it already for you and they're deeply embedded, or you're working in a system that was already built on Webpack, or you're making a better choice. And there's a very, very good chance that better choice is Vite. I am pumped to see this journey come to an end, and I am so thankful I don't have to spend all of my time deep inside of these Webpack modules and weird configs anymore. God, I haven't had to dig into a Webpack config for years. Honestly, I haven't had to do it since I was filming this, and the amount of trauma I felt flash back into my head while looking there, yeah, we're in a much better place. I hope you guys appreciate the amount of improvement this ecosystem has seen, and as much as you might be tired of the bundling churn, that churn is over now. We have a winner. The winner is Vite, and I'm very excited to see what this means for the ecosystem going forward. Let me know what y'all think, and until next time, keep bundle splitting.